Okay, the shir is dedicated to Nishmas Rachelea Bas Rav Chaim Tzvi. I just want to give a little introduction onto how this class is going to work. This is a beginner's class in Hilchos Shabbos, in the laws of Shabbos. And just to give an outline of what I envision over here, is what we're going to do is, instead of giving full 1 hour classes, we're going to divide the class, or the 1 hour class, into shorter segments of 15 minutes each. And the basic idea is to get a basic overview of the topic that we're going to learn, and then really focus on the practical applications, the halacha l'maisa of the given area. And I think, as today will illustrate, it'll be a good illustration of how the classes will generally work. But again, the vision is we're going to break it up into nice bite-sized 15-minute segments, and we'll get an overview of the topic, and then go into some practical applications of the halachos that we will be studying. So the first topic I'd like to discuss is the malacha of kosher. Kosher means kuf vav shin reish, means to tie knots on Shabbos, and we're not allowed to. One of the 39 malachos is we're not allowed to tie knots on Shabbos. Every malacha has its source in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and we derive what exactly is where did they tie knots in the Mishkan? Where exactly was this done? So the Talmud tells us that this was done when just like you make a tent. When you go ahead and want to make a tent, you want to make sure it's tied fast to the ground. It's not going to blow away. Weather is not going to impact it. So the Talmud tells us that the prohibition, the source of tying knots in the Mishkan was Yesedos Oalim, the binding of the pegs of the tent. They would go ahead and tie the tent down to pegs, and this was the malacha of tying knots. It was meant to be done for a relatively permanent period of time, because after all, the Jewish people in the Midbar did not know when they were going to travel from place to place. It was unknown to them, so it could have been for very, very long periods of time that they were tying these knots, and therefore that was a permanent type of knot. However, they did know that it was going to be undone at a certain point. They were promised to go into the land of Israel, and therefore it was understood that it was done with a vision of perhaps in the future untying, but since it was done for a very long duration, they didn't know exactly how long that duration will be, so that is considered to be a meaningfully permanent knot. That's going to be an important point. Corollary to the Isser, to the prohibition of tying knots on Shabbos, is also a prohibition of untying knots on Shabbos. And that's going to be very relevant, because just like they had to tie the knots of the Mishkan, they also, when they traveled, they would untie these knots, and therefore there's two malachos that we're really going to be discussing together. There's the malacha of tying knots, and there's the malacha of untying. And any knot that you're prohibited from tying on Shabbos, you'll also be prohibited from untying. So by basically discussing tying, we will also discuss the topic of untying. Now, there is a Mishnah in Shabbos, Masechet Shabbos, in the Gemara Shabbos, on Daf Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Beis 111b, which tells us that there are certain types of knots that used to be made historically, which would be biblical knots that one is not allowed to do under any circumstance. The classic example is what is referred to as the Kesher Hagamalim, the knots of the camel drivers. What did these camel drivers do? Imagine yourself driving a camel, you need to park the camel. So when you'd park the camel, you would go ahead and you'd have to make sure your camel did not run away. They would take the rope that was attached to a nose ring in the animal's nose, and they would tie it to these various posts. Or imagine a more practical example is a sailor. A sailor, when he wants to dock his boat, so he has a rope that he ties to the pier. Now, that rope, the end of the rope that he ties to the pier, so that knot that he makes on the pier is not a permanent knot. Not a permanent knot. However, the other side of the rope that's on the boat itself, that's a permanent knot. That's what we call a kesher shel kayama, a permanent knot. It's going to be never intended to really be undone. That is the type of knot that if you make on Shabbos, never to be undone, that's going to be a biblical prohibition. An Isser D'Oraisa, biblical prohibition. Everyone agrees that a permanent knot is going to be an Isser D'Oraisa. I shouldn't say everyone agrees, but in order to create a biblical prohibition, it has to be a permanent knot, and therefore the classic types of permanent knots that are made are the camel driver's knot, the sailor's knot, Now the camel driver, just to clarify, the knot that we're talking there again is the knot that will be attached to the nose of the camel nose knot, if you will, because that's permanent. When you tie the camel to the post, just like when you put the boat on the pier, you tie it to the pier, the one on the pier on the post, that is not permanent. The one on the boat and on the camel, that's a permanent knot. Similarly, and this really gets us heavily into our topic, is the Talmud tells us that a shoemaker, when he makes a knot on Shabbos, so that kind of knot is also going to be biblically prohibited. So let's talk about shoelaces and shoe knots on Shabbos. That's going to be our most practical application, and that's going to really open the door up to this whole discussion of tying knots on Shabbos. When it comes to a shoemaker's knot, the Talmud records that there are 3 types of shoemaker's knots. Sometimes a person can make a knot on shoes and it'll be a biblical prohibition. Wow. Other times a person